Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jen, and I am joined by a fantastic writer who is here to talk about an absolutely riveting novel, a work of dark academia, and a really engaging mystery type thriller. And I am so excited. So, welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Of course, and thank you for that introduction. So my name is Jacqueline Faber, and this book, which is called The Department, is about a college girl who disappears and about a philosophy professor whose life is sort of imploding, and he becomes obsessed with the mystery of her disappearance. And as he sort of starts this unauthorized investigation into it, it leads him back to his closest friends and colleagues in his academic department. And the story is told through their dual perspectives. Lucia's story starts a year before she disappears, and it sort of chronicles her life up until her disappearance. And Neil's story starts sort of on the day he finds out she's disappeared and ends when he figures out what has happened to her. And their stories are intertwined. So you're kind of going back and forth as he's uncovering something, then you might see it in the next chapter from her perspective, which is usually a little bit different.
Yeah, I really love the way that the perspectives speak to each other. And I have so many questions about that and character and influences. But before we get to the book itself, could we talk a little bit about the journey there? I
Yeah.
understand that you have a PhD in comparative literature and you've done a lot of really interesting research in various places around the world. So could you talk a little bit about your career and what led you to this project?
Yes, that's my life has been very ambling. Um, so I have lived in many different places. So I started in college. I moved to Italy just as my year abroad, and fell in love with Italy and fell in love with the very humbling experience of being sort of out of my comfort zone. I mean, when I arrived, I moved there back in like 1997. So I didn't even have a cell phone. I lived in Bologna, and we basically got dropped off. I went through the University of California. We basically got dropped off and they were like, go find your apartment. And so we'd be like wandering the university halls, ripping little tags of like people's phone numbers off, calling them from payphones. I mean, really, it was such a humbling experience. And, it was Bologna. So it wasn't like Florence where everyone spoke English. And that experience of learning to communicate in a different language, as challenging and frustrating as it could be at times, I think really informs so much of the way that I sort of look at the world and inhabit the world. And it also made me fall in love with moving abroad. So any chance I had to move abroad, and many of them were through academia, but also, I mean, even as I also used to dance, and like I moved to Brazil as a dancer for a short period of time, like anything I could do to get abroad. And at the same time, I was sort of moving through school. I studied philosophy as an undergrad, and then I went to NYU, like you did, for my master's, and then I went on to Emory for my PhD. And this book really, so I was writing my dissertation and I was writing it on loss. And, like, what does it mean? Like, what presuppositions are we making when we say, like, I lost something? Like, what presuppositions about having something, about possession? Like, what does it mean to lose a thing? Do we lose people or ideas or notions of the future, ideas about the past? And so as I was writing this, I went through a personal loss of my own. And that conflict between sort of this very highly theoretical stuff I was working on and the like excruciating pain of like getting through the day. I think that confrontation, it must have become lodged in the back of my brain. And I finished my dissertation and I got my PhD back in 2012. So these ideas were clearly like percolating back somewhere in the back of my mind. Um, but this book, when it took shape, um, which was, I think I wrote it in 2021. um, and really, I was just sort of haunted by this image, this very visual, mental image of this young girl, this young woman's face on a missing person poster. And I was like, wow, like who is this girl? And like why is she inhabiting my brain? And originally when I started writing it, I because I was coming to her from the outside, I was writing it from Neil's perspective. I was like, this philosophy professor he's gonna have to figure this out. But as I was writing it, her voice was just sort of getting into my head. And I realized at some point, probably halfway through, no, she has to have a voice on this page as well. So that brought a whole bunch of other challenges, figuring out, how do they speak to each other across this time divide and both of them, and actually all of the characters, are informed by different relationships to their own traumatic pasts. And how do those traumas speak to each other? Long-winded answer.
So interesting to me. And I think it is really interesting, the way that the dual perspectives and the switching back and forth allows you to, yeah, see how their experiences communicate with each other, yes, but also like how like trauma is compounded over time, and it's like it's this constant like revisiting of something that happened. And what really struck me, and I spent a lot of time thinking about, is how much that like traumatic repetition of going back to something and looking at it over and over again can look like scholarship, like what we do in
Oh,
academia. Like, and that just like was really interesting to me.
oh my God. I just love everything you just said. And also even the way that, you know, like there's something about trauma that disrupts our sort of linear notions of time, right? When you have a traumatic event, it doesn't just stay lodged in the past, right? It can surge up into your present and and feel like you're experiencing it in the moment, and it can sort of arrive unannounced, and it can drag you back into that space. So I mean, I love everything you just said. I think it's so spot on.
And like especially when it relates to so one of our protagonists, Neil, because I'd love to ask about shaping his character and sort of like what it means to be like an unreliable narrator. Because he's obviously had lots of terrible experiences, including like the dissolution of a marriage and the sort of like the precarity of his career. But he's also has been rocked by sort of like something that has fundamentally like destabilized like the research he's built his career on.
Yes, yes.
Like, so yeah, could you talk a little bit about Neil, where he finds
Okay.
himself in the story and sort of, yeah, how he as an academic kind of plays into
Yes.
how everything
Oh,
works?
great question. So one thing I've just also noticed about my own, like I find myself drawn to protagonists, and I've been in some of the other books I'm working on now, um, who are at a kind of a crossroads in their intellectual, professional lives, where they're feeling a kind of like ennui or like an existential like lethargy, or they're feeling disconnected from their work. I don't know what that's about. I have to investigate my own like underpinnings on that. But in this particular case, the research you're referring to is this Kitty Genovese murder that happens in Queens, New York in 1964. And really, so the story of Kitty Genovese, for those who aren't familiar, it's this woman is coming home from work at a bar um, in the early hours of morning, and she is assaulted and murdered, and it takes place over like half an hour, and it really became famous because 38 people, quote unquote, like witnessed this event, and the narrative at the time was that no one did anything about it. So Kitty Genovese became synonymous with kind of bystander apathy, something that happened in like sort of these urban spaces where people didn't really weren't looking out for each other. And I wrote on that a little bit as an undergrad. And that narrative was like very compelling. And actually, I mean, it changed the way that I behaved at times. I mean, I remember once I was in Bologna, and this older woman was crossing the street and she fell. She fell. I mean, I don't know if she'd had a heart attack, but she fell down. And normally, my thinking would have been like, well, I'm not prepared. How can I help her? I don't know how to deal with someone who's experiencing this. But because I was aware of this bystander apathy theory, I went right up to her. I mean, the ambulance eventually came, but it really did change the way that I looked at and thought about my own reactions to things. But I think it was in 2015, Kitty Geneviese's brother was like how could 38 people actually do nothing? And so he started this investigation into it really through a documentary called The Witness. And it kind of through a bunch of questions and cast into doubt some of those initial readings. And I will say, I mean, the Kitty Genovese murder, like there was no 911 before Kitty Genovese. That murder really brought 911 into existence. And it's not that what they found was like all of the information that came out afterwards was incorrect, but it really cast a lot of doubt on that. And I remember when that documentary came out, I remember thinking, wow, I'm glad I'm not working on Kitty Genovese because, like, how do you, when you become very tied to a certain kind of theory, even if it reflects very poorly on humanity, like, and Neil says early on in the book, like, this is good news for humanity, but like terrible news for me personally. I mean, he's an ethicist. He's writing about ethics, and he's like, oh my God, no, like, no, I want them to have been bad because he's sort of, linked to this idea about the bystander, but he's also, for very personal reasons, like has always had a fear of being a bystander, for various reasons that become complicated over the course of the novel. I mean, at the beginning, he links it to this early memory he has. Um, of this woman drowning on a beach, where he has this very vivid memory of everyone sort of standing on the beach watching her drown. There's a riptide, and so no one goes out to save her. And when she's finally pulled in, it's too late. And so this sort of haunting memory. And it's interesting. I actually had to call my mom. I said, I have this memory of my own. I just wrote about it actually. Um, I must have been 7 years old, and we were all staying. My mom's from a town called Salinas in Northern California. And I remember all of us staying in her old room. Her sister was living in the house at the time, and the windows were open, and it was like warm air wafting in. And I've always been a terrible sleeper. And I remember hearing a woman scream. And I remember I was already awake, but my eyes sort of shot open, and I looked around the room, and no one else stirred, no one else moved, no one else did anything. And even at that young age, such a profound sense of my own like powerlessness, but also almost like a fear of acknowledging it because it would make it real. And I remember lying there thinking, if I hear it again, I'm going to wake people up. And I didn't hear it again, and I didn't wake people up, but I have been haunted by that sort of memory of my own inaction. And I think, that must have found its, I mean, I wasn't thinking about that consciously when I wrote the book, but clearly some of those questions seep into the work.
Wow, my gosh. Yeah, it's so interesting to think of how, like he studies the bystander effect, and it feels like it's, this novel is starting at a point where, he is feeling like a bystander in his own life almost. And
Yes.
so he gets this like initiating event, the sort of like the disappearance of this student, um at exactly sort of like, I don't know if you want to call it the right or wrong time.
Yes.
And it
Yeah.
really it propels the plot forward from there. Um, so could you also talk a little bit about Lucia, writing her perspective, and your process of interweaving them? I'm curious about, like, how much shifting around of puzzle pieces is there?
Mm.
And does like the
Hmm.
juxtaposition in different ways bring stuff out that you then tease out more? Like,
Mm.
how much do they speak to each other when you start as opposed to when you end?
Mm. Great question. So I will say when my first draft of this, um, like there were certain aspects of her voice that felt very clear to me. Like in one of the opening chapters, like she kind of inhabits this, um, I mean, everyone in this book inhabits a kind of morally gray area. I mean, in the first chapter already, you're seeing her at a frat party, like hooking up with some guy from class while her boyfriend is downstairs, right? And so there were certain things about her character that felt clear to me. Like like when that scene came to me, I didn't yet know what had happened to her or why she might be behaving in this way. And in fact, I sort of feel like for both of them, and maybe all of the writing I do in general, like certain aspects of character will feel very like this, I just know this is how this is. And I'll start, and I'm almost writing to be like, why would you behave this way? Like, why would you do this thing? And so with Lucia, I had that clear visual of her at this party. And I was like, what? Like, what are you doing? Your boyfriend's downstairs? Like, what is happening here? And so as I wrote, I was almost writing to uncover that mystery as well. And even the whole first draft, when I figured out sort of what the actual mystery was and who the perpetrators were and how things, I mean, even I remember when I came to the conclusion, like who had done what. And I remember being like, oh my God, like, why would this character behave in this way? Even though, and then I had to go back and figure out, all right. So I really felt like an investigative process for myself. Like, I mean, it felt deeply psychological, like trying to understand and really approaching characters with a lot of empathy. And so that first, that first draft, I wasn't very consciously, you know, filling their backstory with trauma. It felt very surface, like what is actually happening in this story. And then I think approaching it with sensitivity and trying to understand what leads characters, what leads people to behave in the ways that we behave, which are often at odds with the values that we hold. I mean, this happens in the real world all the time, where we might espouse a certain sort of ethical position or believe that we're going to act in a certain way. And when it comes down to it, we don't behave in that way. And then you have a choice. You can either say, it's too painful for me to really look at this, or I'm going to try to understand like what leads me to do these things. And so I think really it felt like a process of excavation. And it's funny because even I don't know, I feel like sometimes when I go back and even read it, there are things that like I didn't even realize when I was writing it that speak to me in ways that I'm like, wow, I didn't intend for it to come off in this way, but yet here we are. So I didn't feel very like programmatic or planned. It sort of felt like it happened very organically.
Yeah, and there's something so cool about making your protagonist of one of the timelines an ethics professor because it both like gives him a really interesting perspective on like what he's uncovering, but it also allows you to comment on sort of, I think, like how we as individuals and as a society like relate to like true crime or crime fiction or crimes that happen around us, you know?
Yes,
And
yes.
I spent a lot of time thinking about like just missing women and the place that they occupy in society and like the Laura Palmer effect and all those things.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we talk about sort of like, yeah, the decision to make him an ethics professor and like weaving that through as well.
Yeah. I mean, he's somebody everything he does is almost unethical. I mean, he's like even to propel the investigation forward, he has to sort of lie to people and make it seem like he's been sanctioned in some he's been requested in some way to look into this stuff. So it's interesting the way that he'll sort of justify to himself the decisions that he makes. But to your point about the true crime thing, it is so interesting. I mean, I was even thinking as I was writing it, and two of my characters in a conversation say to each other, like, why is it always like the dead woman's body? Why is it always the woman's body? Why? And yet, like, this is a book about a missing girl. And so I think I was sort of interested, like, even in myself, like like we're drawn to these sort of salacious um stories. Like we can't, sometimes we almost feel like we can't even help it, even as we're on this other register acknowledging what we're doing. And so I think for me, one of the biggest challenges of this was to write about, particularly for Lucia, her trauma in a way that didn't sensationalize it and didn't romanticize it, and yet had to in some way acknowledge like this book is not is in no position of like it is not making a kind of judgment call on that instinct of ours to rubberneck or to dive into the true crime stories. I mean, why are we so fascinated by them? Like, what is it? I don't know. And mystery in general, like mystery in general feels so compelling. Like, how can we do anything but stare and try to understand? So all these questions are swirling through it. I don't feel like I have any perfect answers, nor do I. I mean, at the end of this book, I do sort of bring up the question of like what kind of answers can we ever offer each other? And in a way, I am programmed to believe that like it's hard enough to ask good questions. Like I don't know how to answer a lot of these questions. All I know how to do is ask them in ways that feel like more and more specific and more compelling.
Yes. And that does like remind me of my time in academia and how, you know, as a historian, you enter grad school thinking that like you're there to learn how to answer questions, but you are there to learn to ask them. And that's
Yeah.
very, very interesting. And I just, I really like the way in which like her narrative, just by lending her so much interiority in addition to other ways, like subverts a lot of those like dead girl tropes, that
Yeah. Oh,
um,
good. I'm glad. I'm glad you felt that way.
how does this relate to I saw on your website and in the blurb for your book that you're interested in studies of character. So I guess
Mm,
that was very clearly at play with like both these characters.
yeah.
How does that sort of approach you or affect your approach to story, like weaving character and story together?
Yes. Well, I think though, I think that my greatest strength as a writer is character. And in fact, I have this memory of, you know, like starting to write when I was very young, like a, ditching recess, sitting in, like the library at my elementary school, writing these stories. And like I never wanted anything bad to happen to the characters. And so like nothing really ever happened. Um, and that doesn't make for a very good story. But in a way, I think it's still true to the way that I mean, lots of bad things happen now, but only because I recognize the need um, for plot. And so I think that my instinct is always character. I love to try to understand people. I loved even my like the most, vile of my characters, like some part of me has to buy into their misbeliefs, their conceits, I have to get on board with them in some way. And so I feel like that is coming from a place of like genuine empathy. Like I try to understand people. But so what that does then is it can make it challenging to move the story along. And in fact, I think that's why I turned to the sort of thriller genre, because plot is so important in thriller. Like it keeps them, you have to keep that momentum high. And so, in early drafts of this, I mean, it was bloated with a lot of like just mental meanderings and musings. And I really did strip so much of that away, because I was like, this has to move. And if it's creating any drag on the momentum of this book, like it doesn't belong in here, which is really hard if you're someone who is interested in what makes people tick. But that I feel like that aspect comes very naturally to me. It's the other stuff that I have to constantly work at and work hard at.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Does it also like tie into your other work? I also read that you are interested in, yeah, memory and loss, language and desire, and all of these things. And the language I think is really important there too. And I'd love
Yeah,
to talk about language because it's the way that feels very obvious to say, but it's the way that we read books, but also the way
yeah.
like plot moves forward when characters talk to each other or they come to realizations.
I
Yeah.
mean, so I'll just tell you the two thoughts that are popping in my mind first. Okay, so first in terms of language, I mean, there's something about trauma that destroys language. I mean, like there's something about like I think about the most painful experiences in my own life and my attempts to sort of narrativize them or put them into words, like it always feels like I failed at the task. Like I somehow can't capture, like I'll say like, well, it sort of feels like this, but this doesn't do it justice, or this doesn't, and so I think there's something about that tension that feels really interesting to me. But also the thing I read for all the time is language. The turn of a phrase to me. Like I read, Stephanie Danler earlier this year, Sweet Bitter. And I mean, I'd have to like put the book aside sometimes just to be like, this woman has I mean, such a gorgeous way with words. And so I feel like there's a kind of seduction working on me in terms of language. And there's also a feeling of like my own limitations when it comes to language. And so I don't know, that tension feels very much at play to me in all of my writing. I don't know if that answered your question, but those are just the thoughts that popped into my head.
Yeah, and trying to put like, what we often refer to as unspeakable into words is like almost generates its own
Yeah.
conflict in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
And
like,
actually, you're making me think even, I mean, even with both of my main characters and their traumas, I mean, their vocalized relationship to the pains of their past is part of what's at stake in this. Like, can can they own their traumas? Can they claim them through language? Becomes really important in this book, and their attempts and their failures, and whether there's a kind of success that happens or not, it was up to the sort of reader to, it's a discussion topic, um but how we either try to avoid our traumas or bring them into light. And I think that that's something that we all have to deal with in our lives all the time.
I'd love if we could talk a little bit about trauma and maybe like how that relates to like the use of an unreliable narrator.
Mm,
Are like different types of unreliable narrators. There are ones who are like lying to us and know they are, and
yeah.
ones who are also lying to themselves. Like,
Yes.
so what do you feel like is at work here? And do you think that trauma sort of like being an unreliable narrator is almost part of the struggle of trauma? Is
Yeah.
that-
Oh, wow. I am literally writing that down and using that in the future. Wow. I love that. And I think that, part of what that makes me think about is, this notion of subjectivity, this idea of us being these kind of like self-encapsulated subjects that have full access. I mean, it comes up in the book, this sort of relationship to our like Cartesian heritage, this I think, therefore I am, this fantasy of having a kind of complete control or understanding, like we are transparent unto ourselves. And I think that more than anything gets really called into question in this book. And so I like what you're saying, because it's almost like trauma like breaks open that notion of the subject in a lot of ways. We are like radically exposed to others. Time itself becomes destabilized and isn't linear. The fiction of a kind of complete cordoned off encapsulated self um, is really at stake here. And so I think um, trying to figure out, like, what does that mean? Like, how would we inhabit the world differently? And I'm asking this as a genuine question. I don't pretend to have an answer. Um, like, what does it mean to move through the world feeling like you are a cordoned off, encapsulated subject versus something that is destabilized, and where there are different aspects of yourself that emerge, or there are different selves that are, a multiplicity of selves inhabiting you at all times. And how does it benefit us? I mean, there's a kind of protective instinct, I think, to the fiction, right? That I am a subject, I know myself, there's a desire for control, that I think serves us in a way. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily get rid of it, but to recognize that there are repercussions to that kind of thinking. And so I think for Neil, Neil feels to me more unreliable. Like, his unreliability is different than Lucia's like relationship to her own trauma. She feels like somebody who is kind of trying to like move past it, and it keeps sort of dragging her back in. Whereas he's deluding himself in a lot of ways, and but in ways that, for listeners who haven't read the book, like, it might lead you to believe one thing, but it's actually the ways in which he's deluding himself are so much more sort of nuanced and complex and characterological.
Yeah. Yeah, it allows you to sort of like explore like both the surface and what lies beneath at the same time with a reliable
Yeah,
narrator, like because you
yeah,
are experiencing that like I guess that disconnect between like what is being said and what is happening or what is
yeah,
good to happen.
yeah.
It's been such a delight to be reading this. And I before we started, I said that like I'm about 20% from the end because I'm so afraid of spoiling the endings of thrillers when I talk to their
Well,
authors.
you have to email me when you finish it, because It's I'll be so curious to hear because there's some major things that happen at the end. Um, so yes, just make sure you reach out.
I will. Making a note right now.
Yeah.
So much for coming by the show and for sharing this book. And, whenever you are, announcing another project, like please feel
Yeah.
free to come back to the show. You're always welcome.
Oh my gosh. Well, I really have loved your questions are so smart and honestly gave me so much food for thought. So I'm going to take all that with me.
Thanks. Okay,
Yeah.
listeners, it's your turn now. You're going to check out The Department. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for your books. All right, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.